So, hello and welcome to part 2 of my ammunition guide. And a short update, practically a sorry. When I uploaded this part, it was 40 minutes long, and it had the wrong thumbnail. I'm sorry, I couldn't change it in time. So, yeah, I screwed it up a bit. So, to make things clear, before I actually begin with the original video, I make some updates for you. First of all, I cut out the last part and make it in a special add-on video, because not everybody wants to know the stuff. So first of all, I talk about the stat card and the meaning of, certain things in there. And then I talk about the last type of shells we have in the game, the chemical-based energy shells, and they are very interesting in my opinion, and I put a lot of effort in it. So again, you will hear it later. Also again, look in the video descriptions. There are some interesting pictures, some interesting videos, and well, you will find a lot of information there if you're looking for it. I put really a lot of effort into that. So thank you for that. So now we actually begin with the original video. And we will start off with the explanations of the symbols and meanings of the stuff in the stat card. I actually wanted to do it in part 1, but it turned out that part 1 would become too long. So it's the very best to be explained on an actual example. And so I use again my 10.5 centimeter Tiger 2 as an example, as it contains actually all the examples necessary. First of all, the actual name of the shell is on top, Panzergranate 39. Then the technical description, APCBC, armor, piercing cap, ballistic cap. So you actually have, at this point I try to explain the cappings and what they mean. So the first capping on top of the shell itself is made out of relatively soft metal that reduces the effect of angled armor, and therefore causes a less negative normalization. Normalization is the change of penetration path to the flight path when interacting with sloped armor. And well, the second shell, the second capping, is the ballistic cap. This is because the first cap is aerodynamically bad, but good for penetration. So it is capped by an even more fragile cap that just serves to give better aerodynamics. That's all the magic. This is done for, I guess, not just APHE shells, but also normal IP shells. There are numerous examples all over in War Thunder. Can't possibly name them all here. So, the next is the symbol itself, and this symbol tells you actually a lot. So first of all, you see how the shell looks, and you see in the first picture the armor piercing effect, if it goes through a lot of armor or not so much armor, and also the damaging effect. And you should compare it through all the ammunition types. Here we can see high explosive, not a lot of penetration going on, but massive damaging effect when you penetrate. And also here we have APCR, much more penetrating power than APCBC, or a little bit more. And the damaging effect is purely kinetic and shrapnel. So let's go back to the Panzergranate 39, and let's just work through all the designations. So for example, the projectile mass, this is the mass of the shell itself basically. The muzzle velocity in meters per second, which is rather high for an APHE shell, 1005 meters per second. Then we come to the interesting part, the explosive type. And here we have pH salts and H10, or pH salts und H10. It's a mixture of two high explosives, and they result in 240 grams for this shell, which is rather high. And now there is a very important part, the TNT equivalent, 343.2 grams of TNT equivalent. This equivalent is very important because all the nations have different high explosives, and they all are different in their value compared to TNT in their pure explosive force. Then we have two stats, and I name the second first. So the fuse sensitivity. The shell has to know when it is time to explode, basically, and so you have a fuse in the cap or at the bottom. It depends on the shell type. And this fuse has a certain amount of armor it has to go through in order to get activated at all. This explains why some APHE shells don't explode when hitting mostly very lightly armored cars or tanks, such as light tanks or AAA vehicles and so on. So that explains why they don't explode. But therefore you see a lot of shrapneling. And this also explains why they are so similar to AP shells, in my opinion. And after that, you see above the fuse delay. So the fuse don't explode immediately. In fact, it has a delay of a certain distance. In this case, 0.8 meters. So that the shell enters the tank and travels to approximately the middle, and when it explodes there, it has the biggest damaging effect. There is one shell where the fuse exchange actually is a researchable module on a tank. There we have the BR350A with MD5 fuse, which has basically no fuse delay, just 15 centimeters, while the researchable one does have a fuse delay of nearly a meter, and you really feel it in the damaging effect. So just to give you an idea what we are talking about. Now back to our 10.5 centimeter Tiger, and let's go on with the stats. Then we have a list of angle of attacks and the chances of ricochets. Now, while this looks pretty good, the spread between 100% chance and 0% chance gives you an idea how reliable this type of shell works compared to towards angled armor. And in this case, APHE, especially the German one, is a bit, well, it sometimes likes to bounce unexpected, you know. And so for angles around about 27 degrees and 42 degrees, APDS and heat are much better. And now we come to the armor penetration values, distance and angle of attack. Now 90 degrees of angle are probably the best for every shell, and here we have 247 millimeters of penetration at 10 meters. Now you see that it falls off over distance, and at 1000 meters we have 217, and at 2000 meters we still have 193 millimeters, which is impressive. Now here comes the important part. When we decrease the angle of attack, so we slope the armor, going from flat armor to a bit of a sloped armor, to around about 60 degrees, we have a decrease in armor penetration, but it is not that huge. We have 223 millimeters at 10 meters, and still 174 millimeters at 2000 meters. But if we further increase the angle of attack, we have 30 degrees, and we just have 110 millimeters. And there is a rule of thumb that is very important here to mention, and that is when you have an armor thickness, or it's actually the armor retaining value, armor penetrating retaining value. That's a bit complicated, isn't it? So this is about the normalization. Now we have here the stats no more. I guess they got removed. And it told us the degree of normalization. Normalization is the interaction sloped armor does to the shell that tries to penetrate when it's angled. So so practically the shell gets a little bit deflected and does have actually an even lower angle of attack, and the lower the angle of attack is, the worse for the penetration process. So, and 30 degrees is a special angle because a rough estimation is that when an angle is at 30 degrees, the armor plate has an effective thickness that is twice as much as the actual thickness of the armor plate. For example, when you look at the T-34 and the front plate of it, it is heavily angled and much thicker in its actual thickness or its line of sight thickness than the armor plate if you look from slightly above, if you know what I mean. This shell actually doesn't have the worst of energy retaining compared to the angle of attack at 30 degrees. Now let's look at the Apcr shell and you really know what I mean. Look at this. At 90 degrees we have 276 millimeters of penetration at 10 meters, and it falls down, remarkably falls down to 212 at 60 degrees, but that's not too drastic, okay? But at 30 degrees we just have 64 millimeters. That's a huge difference. If we take this into account, what I just said, if an APHE shell or an AP shell would have 64 millimeters of penetration at 30 degrees, you can calculate around about 130 to 140 millimeters of penetration at 90 degrees. And that's round about half the penetration this Apcr has here. So the effect is drastic. At this point I have to stop it here because it would take too long. But I hope you understand what I mean. And this is what those actual numbers mean. Don't go overwhelmed by this huge cluster of numbers. Just compare them and watch the, so to say, the downfall of numbers, and you will get actually a lot of knowledge from it. One shell we could have, or two shells that we could have a look at as well, the Leopard 1. When we look at its APDS shell, you see that we have a much better energy retaining in terms of penetration against sloped armor compared to Apcr. It's not so good compared to the heat shell, because look at this. Those are clean numbers. The reduction of penetration is around about 1/8 of the actual penetration at 90 degrees when we lower the angle of attack to 60 degrees. And at 30 degrees we have the mathematical equivalent practically to, if you would calculate it with a calculator, we have half the penetration values at all distance. This is the nice thing about heat, and I will talk about heat in a moment. So, after talking about the stat cards and the rest of the stats for the APHE shells and their meaning, let's talk about the chemical energy based weapons. Compared to shells that rely on their speed and mass to punch through armor, so the propellant, the distance to the target, the gun, the capping of the shell, the muzzle velocity and all that stuff, all those things are highly important for those kinetic energy based shells. For chemical energy based shells, however, I have to tell you a bit of a different story. In general, the destruction of the ammunition is purely caused by an explosion on the surface of the armor it hits. The gun, the propellant, muzzle velocity and so on are not really that important. The really important part is to hit the target at all, and then the destruction power comes from the high explosive mass. An explosion is a violent chemical process, therefore the name, chemical energy based weapons. Important is the mass of high explosive filling and the caliber. Why the caliber matters will be covered a bit later. First, I have to talk about a possible misunderstanding. APHE shells are a child of both the kinetic energy and chemical energy world, so to say. The reason why I put them into the kinetic energy based shell part is simple. They fit there better. They have too much in common with AP shells than compared with chemical energy based shells. And their penetrating power purely relies on kinetic energy. Also, they can kill enemy tanks even without their fuse going off, so acting like a normal AP shell, but are useless if they don't penetrate in the first place. Let's begin with, on the first look, most simple shell type based on chemical energy. HE, or high explosive. It is simply a shell filled with a lot of high explosive. When hitting a target, the fuse goes off and causes an explosion. This explosion is very devastating at close range and goes in all directions, so basically radial or spherical. Capable of punching through weak armor. The penetrating values just rely on the explosive mass and are, as mentioned before, independent from the distance to the target, but also independent from the angle of armor or angle of attack, unless the angle is so small that the fuse doesn't make contact with the armor. This shell type allows you to penetrate armor plates you didn't even hit with the shell itself. A perfect example for that is when you shoot the upper casemate of a Ferdinand with a KV2 shell. This is something I learned from the kill cam and also the stat card. There are a lot of examples where you can dub enemies in the face. The most famous and extensive example I have, well, is about the Russian 122mm guns and the 120. The most famous and extensive example I have is about the Russian 122mm guns and the 152mm howitzers. They contain so much high explosive that their penetration caused by the blast is big enough to dub enemies rather reliable if you know where to shoot. Especially in arcade battles, you can take on Russian heavy tanks. Aim beneath the gun and maybe the driver's hatch for Russian heavy tanks, or simply next to the gun for Russian mediums. You also can use this tactic with the American M103 with its high explosive shell and the German 128mm gun, which is mounted on the Yak Tiger, the Mouse, and also the E100, if you own one, like I do. I just lost all my subscribers. Oh well, it happens, I guess. One final thing to know about HE. Rule of thumb is that under 100mm they just are of use against light AAA vehicles or planes, and howitzers in general have better HE shells than guns of same caliber. As an example, compare the 10.5cm King Tiger and its high explosive shell compared to the howitzer of the M4A3 105 Sherman. And also the 122mm gun of the Soviet heavy tanks and the T-44 122. Just saying. The second shell type is HESH. That stands for High Explosive Squash Head. This is practically a high explosive shell, but is a bit different. In fact, this shell needs between 200 and 400 meters per second to splash the high explosive mass over a certain area of the armor plate. Then the fuse goes off and the explosion causes an impulse that goes through the armor plate. At the other side of the armor plate, this impulse has nowhere to go and the armor plate material just simply reacts with shrapneling. You can imagine this like a Newton pendulum, link in the video description. This is the only ammunition type that doesn't penetrate the armor plate itself. Also, the penetrating values are independent from the distance to the target, but not independent from the angle of attack, because the splash area of the high explosive mass covers a larger area when the attacked armor plate is angled, therefore reducing the impulse density and causing less shrapnels as well. HESH is absorbed totally by spaced armor, but also is in general pretty unreliable in the game so far in my experience. Bad news for the M60, the Leopard, and again all the British high-tier tanks. Of course, the Russians are the only nation that don't have access to HESH, so they don't suffer from its unreliability. At this moment, I'm writing the script, and out of the blue Gaijin makes a server update where they buff the effectiveness of HE shells against lightly or unarmed targets. I swear someone at Gaijin is watching me. And people said I'm insane installing all those snail traps everywhere. Okay, the last shell type is heat. It stands for high explosive anti-tank. It is also known as shaped charged or hollow charged, and is effectively the same warhead as you use for a bazooka or a Panzerschreck. This is probably the most difficult shell type to explain, so we'll find a lot of links in the video description. Also, now there was a post from one of the Warthunder devs regarding solid shots, so there are additional links in the video description. How heat works and how it was discovered and so on is an interesting story of its own. The short form, its discovery was more or less an accident, but the connection to use this physical process as a weapon required a big brain. Basically, there is a copper cone or copper pin on the tip of the shell, and it faces away from the armor it is intended to hit. It is surrounded by a lot of high explosive. Now it gets a bit complicated if you haven't heard anything about it yet. Basically, between the copper cone and the armor is a gap covered by a ballistic cap, and therefore it is also called hollow charge. When the high explosive gets triggered, it causes the copper cone to collapse, and there is just one way it can go: towards and through the armor. The high impulse and gas pressure causes a supersonic collapse of the copper cone, which then acts as a superfluid metal beam. This metal beam is so centralized, fast, and does have so much pressure that the armor plate made out of steel acts like a fluid itself. This is out of your daily experience and also mine, and so it is difficult to imagine in the first place. The interaction and results are very high penetration values on normal armor. With normal armor it's basically steel armor. And best type of shell for penetrating even highly sloped armor plates. This heat shell doesn't get any normalization at all, so it is directly penetrating in the line of sight. Now there is no ultimate ammunition in reality or within Warthunder, and so heat also comes with some drawbacks. Some of them are pretty drastic in my opinion. First we have to mention spaced armor. Spaced armor is practically two or more armor plates on top of each other with a significant gap between them. This results in the copper beam losing its optimal focus. Again, a long physical explanation why and how it works. I simply have to cut it out here. Well, this seems to be not implemented correctly in Warthunder, since I was penetrated and killed often by the PT-76's 200mm penetrating heat shell through my hull front, and not just any hull front. It was the Super Pershing's hull front, where there are 3 layers of spaced armor, and the combined effective thickness of the steel plates together exceeds 200mm. At least I hope I calculated right. Because of lack of other infos or statements from Gaijin, I just say it's broken. If you have a better explanation, let me know. About further drawbacks of heat. The damage effect is more or less comparable to APCR or APDS, so it is not the most devastating shell. But it seems a bit less reliable against ammo racks, so often ammo racks go black but don't explode. Well, that is at least my opinion and experience. I have no numbers provided, or no numbers and statistics I can point my finger on. My biggest problem, however, is the fuse. It is very sensitive and comparable to HE and HESH. While I guess that is close to reality, it offers a big problem. You cannot shoot through trees, bushes, fences, or other light-walled houses or any other sort of debris or object, like you can with solid shots. So the shell will practically explode in mid-air, and for example cleaning the way with machine gun fire, like you can knock over fences, is not always possible, and also gives away your position, especially in a realistic battle and simulator battle. Combined with the fact that you can't change a shell once it is loaded with my playstyle makes tanks that rely on their heat shells, such as the M60 or the Leopard, not much enjoyable to play for me. Again, that is just my opinion. But now we are done with all the ammunition types. So again, I have to apologize for the re-upload, and I just want to let you know that I'm about to re-upload also the part I cut out in a separate video, add-on video, and it's also really interesting for a relatively generalized overview on what I think on which ammunition to use on which tank. But it will take again up to, I guess, over 15 minutes, so I just shortened this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a little bit. Let me know in the comment section which improvements you would make, or if I talked too much or even didn't talk too much or not enough. So thanks for watching, and see you on the battlefield.